speaker that we're going to have. She's the campaign coordinator for this project, and she's the author of the forthcoming biography of Sylvia Pankhurst. Please give a warm welcome to Katherine Connelly.
Thank you very much. Thank you everybody so much for coming to this launch. It's been an absolutely wonderful event. I hope everybody agrees. I'm going to talk a little bit about Emily and where her action came from, and a bit about the campaign. But first of all, I want to say that the life and the struggles and the death of Emily Wilding Davison, I think, are a real reminder never to be complacent about the rights and the freedoms that we've won. If you think about Britain at the beginning of the 20th century, and the people that ruled Britain at the beginning of the 20th century were very kind of smugly self-satisfied that they stood in this great tradition of liberal democracy, and this is what they represented. And yet what you found at the beginning of the 20th century was that as soon as people stood up to demand their rights, they found that all the freedoms that they thought they had in theory, in practice meant absolutely nothing. And you look at what was going on at that time. Welsh miners who went on strike, the government sent in troops and people were shot at the time. If you think about the end of the year 1913, actually a whole group of employers locked out their whole workforces, basically to starve their workforces out of being in a union. And when you look at the women's campaign for the vote, women were beaten up in front of Parliament, and while the MPs stood on a balcony and watched that happen, and you know, some of them were photographed kind of laughing at that. The suffragette newspapers, the government went and put massive pressure on the people that were printing it and basically banned the publication of suffragette newspapers. And of course, very, very many of them were denied the status of even being sort of granted a political prisoner status when they were sent to prison in the course of their campaigning. And I think that it's very, very important that all of Emily Davison's actions are seen in this context, because the escalation of militancy was first and foremost a response to the intensification of the state violence and state repression against these women. And Emily was part of a group of women who kind of kept inventing militant tactics, very much as Diane was saying, and very often without consulting the leadership. They just went ahead and did it. And so when the suffragettes organised an absolutely massive demonstration to prove to the government just how popular their cause was, they organised a huge demonstration in 1908, and the government just ignored it. And then when the suffragettes went on a deputation to Parliament to say, we've done this huge demonstration, I think now you should take some account of this, they sent the police up, and the women were beaten up. And it was as a response to that violence that one of Emily Davison's closest friends, an amazing woman called Mary Lee, that's when she drove down to Downing Street and became one of the first stone throwers, and they threw stones through the windows of number 10. And as Diane was saying, Emily was the first to use arson in the campaign. And when she set fire to that pillar box, that was very, very shortly after her close friend Mary Lee, who was a working class suffragette. She was a teacher, she was married to a builder, she'd been put in prison at the same time as the suffragette Lady Constance Lytton was put in prison. And as you probably gathered, Lady Constance Lytton was an aristocrat. And convicted of the same offence at the same time, Mary Lee got a much longer prison sentence than did Lady Constance Lytton. And so it was very shortly after that, and almost certainly in protest at that Emily set fire to her first postbox. And when she was amongst the sort of first group of women to be force-fed in prison when they went on hunger strike, and they went on hunger strike to demand that they were treated as political prisoners. And it was after she was first force-fed that Emily Davison barricaded her cell and enacted this resistance, even while she was in prison. She basically sort of tore the beds off the wall and stacked the beds up and blockaded the door. And for doing that, to force her out of the way, the prison authorities put a big fire hose through the window and trained that on her for at least 15 minutes. And she still didn't move, so she was an amazing person. But that resistance that she enacted was in direct response to the force feeding of women that was happening in the prisons. And on another occasion when she was in prison, there was they force feeding a huge number of suffragette prisoners, and you could, obviously you could hear it happening, cell after cell after cell. And it was in response to that and in protest at that Emily Davison ran and threw herself off the railings in Holloway Prison and landed and badly injured herself on an iron staircase, thinking that one big tragedy, one big action would surely force these people to stop. So every time, these were very, very political protests against what the state was doing to them. And of course, her last action in June 1913, the one for which she died, that happened amidst the introduction of the Cat and Mouse Act, which basically was the government's new way of dealing with hunger striking suffragettes, which was because of the outcry about forcible feeding. When they were starving, very, very weak, they'd release them for a few days, and then when they thought they could endure a bit more starving in prison, they'd rearrest them. So this meant that prison sentences went on and on and on, because of course the women didn't give up. The rearrests were massively unpleasant, and there were huge fears that the leaders of the movement, people like Emily Pankhurst, Annie Kenney, Sylvia Pankhurst, were in danger of dying. And it was in the context of that kind of atmosphere and that kind of repression that Emily did her very last action in June 1913. And I think sometimes when we talk about this, obviously, you know, it was very tragic what happened to Emily Davison, but when you read about her and you read about her friends and the kind of things that they did, you know, she was actually an incredibly cheerful person, incredibly witty, and always found sort of, you know, witty sort of tactics and things to do. And she had to be a real master of sort of subterfuge and disguise and masking things to get away with a lot of these very daring tactics. She broke into the House of Commons 3 times, on sort of 3 separate occasions, and hid in there because apparently the penalty for that was that you would then get tried by Parliament. She was desperate to have her moment like on the floor of the House of Commons, and they didn't let her. Just chucked her out again and she'd have to sneak back in. And one amazing example of you know, how sort of clever and the subterfuge that was involved with these kind of women was one time when she was arrested, and very often when they were put in the cells in Holloway Prison, they were put in these horrible sort of fetid cells, there's no air, and the women in protest at the way they were being treated would smash the windows. So of course, the first day in, Emily has smashed the windows. And so this is what she wrote about what happened next. And I think, you know, you've got to bear in mind how these women were treated when they were dragged into prison. They were forced to change their clothes, everything was taken off them, all their personal possessions, they'd be searched. But nevertheless, this is what happened to Emily after she'd smashed all the windows in her cell. She wrote later, "Then they rushed me into another cell in which everything was fixed." Obviously to stop people from, you know, pulling things up and smashing the windows again. "But I broke 7 panes of that window, to the matron's utter astonishment, as I had a hammer. I could not have done it otherwise." So, you know, even so, you know, with all this sort of searching and stuff, she managed to get a hammer into the prison so she'd carry on doing damage. And so obviously her actions were, I think, first and foremost a response to the violence, the state-sponsored violence against women. But I think it was also, she very much hoped that this would galvanise public outrage about what was happening to the suffragettes. And really, the friendship group that she was in, the group of suffragettes that she was involved in, were really grappling with the problem of how they could reignite a public interest and sympathy in the cause in a way that had been manifested early on and characterised the early militant movement, which had, you know, received massive amounts of support. And it was a movement that had emerged out of other people's struggles, most prominently the unemployment movements, in which lots of women were involved. And this is where the sort of early support from the movement came from. And I think partly this loss of support for the campaign as it went later on, and this difficulty with connecting with people, was actually due to a policy which was not to engage with any of the wider struggles that were happening later on in the decade. And so when the Great Unrest kicked off, which was this huge strike wave that of largely unorganised working class people all across Britain, and crucially, which involved thousands upon thousands of women workers for the very, very first time. It was the first time they became politicised, and they literally just marched out of work despite not being in a union or anything like that. They'd created their own organisations, they'd march out against low pay, about the way that they were treated at work, all of these kind of things. So these were women coming into action, seizing politics for the very, very first time in their lives. And the response of the suffragette leadership was to, you know, sort of really distance themselves from this sort of thing. And they said, well, this is just proof that women ought to have the vote, and when women have the vote, these won't be problems anymore. And when men went on strike and took these kind of actions, they actually said they shouldn't be doing it at all because they had the vote. And so really there was this kind of reinterpretation of the vote, I would argue, by some of the leadership of the militant suffragettes, which from the vote being something that was integral to social struggles that would change society, to becoming an end of those social struggles, and for then sort of trusting in other people. And that really did, I think, sort of fail to connect with the new militant mood that was sweeping the country. But interestingly, not all the suffragettes obeyed this command. Sylvia Pankhurst certainly went down to Bermondsey, which was where one of the biggest strikes of women took place. It was a huge strike on all the docks in the Great Unrest, and also in the warehouses where all the women were working, and the packing factories. And women teamed out onto the streets in Bermondsey, and it was a very, very militant moment in history. And we know that Sylvia Pankhurst went down to interview those women. But also our own rebel, Emily Wilding Davison, also went down there. And this is what she wrote about that struggle for the Morning Post. What the girl strikers enjoyed, and what the suffragettes have enjoyed in undergoing their most horrible experiences, has been that joy in at last asserting their individuality as free-born Britons. And I think this is really interesting, Emily's little secret detour down to Bermondsey, if you like, and the way that she wrote about it. Because she didn't belittle their struggle, she didn't prioritise her own struggle above theirs. Actually, she saw them as part of the same struggle. And I think that's what's very, very striking about her. She always saw the wider oppressions that were going on in society as well, and she wanted to fight those, and fighting for the vote for her was absolutely integral to fighting all the other injustices in society. She was a member of the Workers' Educational Association, she was on the executive of the Marylebone branch, and she was also involved in the Central Labour College. And this, her sense of the wider struggles that needed to be fought and that were integral in the campaign for the vote was also reflected in her funeral. And you know, I'm sure lots of people have seen the photographs of the funeral which took place in the streets of Bloomsbury, just down there. And of course, first of all, it was all the suffragettes dressed in white who'd come to honour their fallen comrades. But behind all the suffragettes, there were other groups represented there as well. There was the Dockers Union, and there was the Gas Workers Union, and there was the Daily Herald League, which was a Labour publication, and then there was the General Workers Union. And there was even a wreath sent by the postal workers from the depot whose pillar box she'd fired, which is lovely. And so Emily Davison, I think, is incredibly important because she did make these links in the struggle, but she did so as an individual, and her organisation didn't. And I think one of the very sad things is that at the same time as she did her action was just at the beginning of Sylvia Pankhurst's move to the East End and her attempt to re-engage, and it was basically a different way, I would argue, what Sylvia did, of trying to engage the masses back in the struggle in the way that it had been at the beginning of the militant campaign. But I think Emily Wilding Davison's death has another significance as well, and the memorialising that Diane spoke about, and the tradition of other suffragettes memorialising what Emily did, I think point to that. And that is that her courage and what she did on that day, I think, still inspires people today. And she was a very mysterious woman. Nobody really she did have lots of friends, but she kept herself to herself. She never told people what she was going to do. She didn't tell anybody about the Derby stunt. And every time you read other people's accounts of her, they're always saying how mysterious, and they didn't quite know what she was thinking. And Sylvia Pankhurst said she had a kind of Mona Lisa smile, which I think sums up that kind of mystery. But I think that mystery is kind of sort of integral to why she's been someone that is so easily identifiable with, because I think in some ways this mystery and her sort of quietness, but also her passion, means that she can be a kind of every woman. And I think she was, you know, that when you were talking about the kind of blending of the Emily Pankhurst, Wilding Davison phenomenon that goes on, I think that's very much because Emily Davison's action did come to represent all suffragettes, and Emily Davison did come to represent all suffragettes. And I think that everybody who wants to fight against oppression now can see her as an every woman for us today. And I think just as in Emily Davison's time, they found that all the things that they fought for so long were suddenly under attack again. I think people here tonight have spoken very well on this, about how now, in a time of austerity, what we're seeing is all the things that we thought we'd won in the past suddenly under attack again. And so it's huge numbers of jobs in the public sector, the majority of which are done by women, absolutely massively under attack. The services that we use, whether that comes from the health service, the rape crisis units that are being slashed all over the country, all of these things suddenly are under attack again. All of the benefits that women receive, their jobs, their services, all of these kind of things. And so I think, you know, we need today more than ever inspirational people like Emily Wilding Davison. She's a part of our history, and so that's why we're calling for the minute silence at next year's Derby, and demanding that that sacrifice is remembered. But I think that we're also doing it because she can inspire us in our struggles in the present.